All right, we're over the hump, more than halfway, passage 6. Let's keep it going. So please make sure you do this passage. Looks like a doozy, huh? But yeah, if you haven't already done it, make sure you do it. Pause the video, then come back. I'm about to head into this right now myself. Here we go. In 3, 2, 1. Okay, so artificial intelligence, job loss, economic value. Okay, so it's definitely in economics. I can already tell. Seems as though it's economics. So I'm thinking, yeah, probably going to be, a little bit more descriptive. But let's see. As a result, right? As a result, okay. Creative self-expression, whether in the form of literal storytelling or something more complex and figurative, may be the replacement to the threat of AI on job loss and suicide. Okay, great. So what is that X to Y? So it's basically saying that there's a AI resulting in job loss and suicide, and the solution here is creative self-expression. Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay. Analyzing the nature of economic value, the principles of scarcity and subjectivity become important. Reframing the problem, it can be understood that what is scarce and subjectively valuable about a person is their collective experiences, thoughts, behaviors, interpretations, insights, and ways of expressing themselves. There seems to be no two people alike, detail for detail, timeline for timeline. Okay, so because people are unique, then apparently something that's scarce and subjectively valuable about a person is the solution to the threat of AI on job loss. Okay, so something that's uniquely subjectively human, or valuable about being a human. Okay, interesting. Shift in tone. So having self-worth directly tied, as is often the case, gain of one factor is loss of another factor, net monetary gain. But here we go. But in addition, so there will generate. Okay, so it seems as though the layout of this passage, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 paragraphs. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe this is where the first shift in tone is. So perhaps this is all context. This is the proof, and this is the conclusion. Okay, let's see. Artificial. Wait, let's pause for a second, real quick. So I'm reminding myself, what is the point? Okay, so the point is that artificial intelligence is causing job loss and suicide, and creative self-expression may be the solution. So my point is, why? Why does the author think that that's the case? That creative self-expression is the solution to this problem. I know they talk about something about being valuable as a person, so let's see. This is a bit of context, so I'm probably going to skip over it pretty quickly. So AI has the potential to incrementally add over blah blah blah. Great, so a lot of growth. Generators of these models tend to look across 5 categories: imaging, image processing, assistance, blah blah blah. Sources of data about the projection of these technologies and the impact of AI across various sectors include blah and blah. In addition to economic benefits, AI will also lead to significant disruptions for workers, companies, and economies. There will likely be considerable costs associated with managing labor market transitions, especially for workers being left behind by AI technologies. But even with these losses, AI is still predicted to be the aforementioned economic boon. So this is the first shift in tone, actually. But again, if we compare it to this conclusion, it doesn't really relate that much. Let's keep reading. So this net monetary gain seems to, we're setting up for a major shift in tone, dwarf the anxieties of job loss, but still many others have given pause. Okay, so this maybe relates a bit more to this. So why are they giving pause? So while thousands of firms focus on statistics for economic gain, millions of others focus on the simple existential question of how to spend their time meaningfully. I see. Okay. So this is the shift right there, is that, yeah, okay, so all this growth is great, and these thousands of firms focus on that gain, great, but millions of others, right, millions is more than thousands, focus on just the simple existential question of how to spend their time meaningfully. All right, so I would say that that's definitely the main sort of shift in tone right here, and that connects to the thesis. So I'm going to pause real quick. So the existential question of how to spend their time due to the sort of job loss that's predicted and stuff like that, that's sort of connecting to this threat of job loss and suicide. I'm not sure about the suicide yet, but let's keep on reading. But it's about this sort of existential problem. So as is often the case, the gain of one factor marks a loss of another factor. The trade-off in this case of increased efficiency, so this seems to be a claim, increased efficiency is a decrease in an individual's sense of purpose. Here we go. So that's the trade-off. A person's self-worth seems to be inextricably linked to their economic value, whether because of the indirect link to social status of economic value or the direct link of income to sustenance. And a person's economic value is tied closely to their competence and skills to execute a task that satisfied another person's needs. People trade their time and skills for money and social status. Okay. When a person's time and skills are no longer economically valuable, there is a gap. Having self-worth directly tied to economic value is a serious concern. Oh, here we go. Now this is the author saying it's an emotional thing right there, a serious concern. As the suicide rate among Americans rose by nearly 30%, with rates increasing by around 50% for middle-aged men, breaking this link is not the only concern. Okay, that's setting us up for a shift in tone. Substituting income with something else is also imperative. So here we go. That's sort of that social sciences, hey, don't forget about me thing. So that's a main point right there. So substituting income with something else is also imperative. Even more so, even more so is the idea to identify a source of value that is more internally derived as opposed to externally or socially derived. Okay, so really the meat of this passage is right here. So all of this is great, and it's not that meaningful or important until the suicide rate comes into play. And it's because the author thinks that actually what's the X and Y is that the cause is the suicide rate, and the X is actually people's self-worth being directly tied to economic value. That's the sort of correlated relation that they're being explained here, and that the issue is not just breaking this link, but substituting it with something else that's more internally derived. That's why all these collective experiences, thoughts, behaviors, interpretations, and insights and ways of expressing themselves, that's why that stuff is more internally derived, and that's why the author thinks that creative self-expression, whether in literal storytelling or something more complex and figurative, may be the replacement that we need to this threat. Okay. So that was a bit tough until the end, but it seemed to be answering all my questions. What is the main thesis? Again, it's about breaking that link of self-worth to suicide or to economic value, and that creative self-expression is the solution for that. So let's see. So having self-worth directly tied to economic value is not of any concern. No, it's bad. The economic benefits of AI outweigh labor market transition costs. That's also weak, but A is really definitely not the case. C says a person's self-worth needs to be untied for the economic value. Much better. Creative self-expression may reduce suicide rates from AI-induced. Yeah, so this is definitely good, but what's even more so is this. So which of the following social programs would the author most likely support? An education program focusing on increasing technical computer skills. Nope. Programs concerned with helping displaced workers share their stories. I like it. Storytelling, creative self-expression. Welfare programs which seek to provide basic income for displaced workers. Nope. Free career services in every municipal public library. Definitely the creative self-expression thing. Suppose that a new economic model comes out which shows that the growth from AI will lead to the creation of millions of jobs. How would this information, if true, affect the author's argument? Well, it would definitely affect the author's argument because it directly impacts this sort of link between, the threat of job loss and suicide. So if it doesn't really threaten job loss, then that doesn't really connect with the suicide, which makes your thing kind of irrelevant. So let's see. So the new information presented would diminish the relevance. Yep. The author's argument would remain unaffected. No. It would support the conclusions? No. It would validate the connection? No. It would invalidate it. So it would be A. So what is the author's tone toward the predicted economic benefit of AI? It's definitely not really tending to be so antagonistic, but it's more like cautious, again, sort of a neutral, but it's not disbelief, not approval, not excitement. So it's something more neutral. What is the most likely reason for the author to state millions of others focus on the simple existential question of how to spend their time meaningfully? Again, this is exactly what that shift in tone was. So just a shift in tone, whatever, to shift away from that previous claim of how thousands of firms focus on the economic gain statistics as opposed to the losses that millions of people focus on. So to suggest that those who focus on economic benefits are immoral, no. To contrast two ways of thinking about the potential impact, that's much better. To emphasize the importance of having an existential purpose, not necessarily. Much more rationalizing there. So I think that B is simpler. To imply that boredom is the root cause, no. So B. Alrighty, just a few seconds over. Again, forgive me for being a little bit slower because I'm narrating it as I go. But very good. Okay. So this passage was, again, not too simple, but I like a couple of these phrases, right? So we know this is economics passage, we know it's social sciences, we know there's going to be some sort of a correlation between X and Y. Something's going to be, just as important as something else to consider. So what those things are, again, I like this phrase, as a result. As a result, it's basically like this arrow right here. It's like, as a result, blah, 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 blah. So this is like a conclusion, right? To be concluded, or, in conclusion, blah, 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 blah. So it's a really nice setup. And then may be the replacement. So this sort of, tells us what the main point of the passage, like where is the author going with this passage? The author is going here. So now our job is to understand, okay, we know where the author's going. Well, how on earth does the author get there? And in this passage, it was really difficult because it took the author a long time to get there. Literally, it wasn't until really paragraph 6 that the author started to really make that connection in terms of why is this even important to talk about. So an important skill to kind of recognize here is that, when you have a passage that has a lot of context, don't spend so much time, right? Really save yourself on that time. Because if you spend, you're looking at the details of this and this and this and this and this, you really waste a lot of time, right? You see that I didn't necessarily do that. And that's why having these layouts help, right? It helps kind of guide my speed, because if I know where more or less this passage is heading and more or less what it might look like, well then I don't need to waste my time with irrelevant details. So some of the things that I highlighted, again, tend to look across. This is sort of like words that set up a shift in tone. They sort of illustrate other people's way of doing things, also lead to, right? Also lead to sort of a shift, saying, hey, not only does it lead to this, it may also lead to that. But being a clear shift in tone, this setting up a shift in tone, this being the shift in tone, this being a shift in tone, although it's subtle, the shift in tone is the difference between thousands and millions, right? That's a subtle shift in tone, but it's still a shift in tone. And and yeah, again, just like another passage we went over before, this first shift in tone, yes, it was in paragraph 3, but it doesn't really connect too much with the end of the passage. So I was kind of skeptical as to whether or not this is really important. Luckily, these ended up being the main thing, that it's about the existential question of how to spend time meaningfully when they lose their jobs. And even more so was this serious concern of suicide rate, right? And so then when the author starts talking about solutions, says that, yeah, breaking the link is not the only concern. It's being able to substitute income or economic value with something else. And even more, you want to substitute with something else that is more internally derived as opposed to externally or socially derived, right? And it said that, again, back to the conclusion, is sort of saying that some things that are internally derived being just the experiences that a person has over their life, and that no two people alike, detail for detail, timeline for timeline, right? So that means that would be valuable, right? So the nature of economic value is the fact that it's something is scarce and subjectively sort of valuable, right? So what is scarce and subjectively valuable about a person is all of their experiences. And so the author thinks that creative self-expression, whether in the form of literal storytelling or something else, may be the replacement to the threat of AI on job loss and suicide. Because when you have your value tied, your self-worth tied to economic value, and those are tied to your skills and your training, well, when those things are no longer valuable, well, what are you going to do, right? So apparently people are committing suicide because of that reason in large amounts, which is pretty scary. So problem types here, again, main thesis, that's foundations of comprehension. Which of these social programs would they most likely support? That's going to be reasoning beyond the text, right? So they're introducing a new support or social program. Suppose that a new model, it's again reasoning beyond the text, it's a new information. What is the author's tone? That's going to be foundations of comprehension. What is the reason why they use this phrase? That's going to be reasoning within the text, your ability to scrutinize why this was used for the argument. And they each have their processes, right? So in this situation, the main thesis, again, the way you want to solve that is you find that sort of main shift in tone, and you connect it with that concluding points, those concluding points, and the combination of those two things represent the scope of information that you would use to determine the best answer. So imagine that there's like 3 points here, right? Point number 1, 2, and 3. So C checks off on one of the points, right? But D really checks off on all of these points here: the self-expression, the suicide rates, and the AI-induced job loss, right? So that's really an important factor to consider, is that which one is the most supported. Even though C is a claim that was made, D is more sort of encapsulates all of the components from the conclusion and this main shift in tone, okay? The idea of economic value as well, that's sort of somewhere in the middle as sort of an evidence and proof for the main thesis, right? So a main thesis is not necessarily the proof, but I would say that this is more sort of a supportive role within the argument as opposed to the main conclusion, which is what this is. Which of the following social programs would the author most likely support? Again, anything that has to do with this conclusion, which is the solution, right? Well, what is the solution that the author considers? Well, these are all solutions, right? So the solution is something that has to do with creative self-expression, whether in the form of literal storytelling or something more complex and figurative. So this is as technical skills, this is basic income, and this is free career services. So again, getting away from the idea of external sources of, or socially derived sources of value, getting away from those and toward storytelling and creative self-expression. New economic model shows that growth would lead to creation of millions of jobs. Well, again, if that's the case, then that makes this whole thing irrelevant, because in the setup, right, the whole setup is that there's a threat of AI and job loss. That's basically the whole context, right? And when something is sort of opposing the entire context in which the argument was set up, then that tends to make the argument redundant or irrelevant, which is what this is. So if this comes out and this is true, then that diminishes, or that basically weakens the context. So again, when you weaken the context of an argument, just to repeat, you diminish the relevance. So it's not necessarily directly affecting the conclusion, right? It's not invalidating the conclusion. That's not the case. It's invalidating the context in which the conclusion is even necessary. So if this stuff is true, that it's going to tend towards job loss, then this becomes relevant. But if this is saying, hey, it's going to lead to a bunch of jobs, well, then all of a sudden this stuff stops becoming relevant. But it still may be a true conclusion. It's just that it's only true if this is the context with which it comes in. So if something threatens the context, then that threatens the relevance. It doesn't threaten or weaken the actual conclusion itself. There's a key distinction there. So tough problem. But what is the author's tone? Again, when it comes to economic, social science type of passages, you kind of want more of a neutral tone. So excitement is definitely off the table. Disbelief or approval, definitely off the table. So something a bit more cautious, right? Pros and cons. What is most likely reason to use this phrase? Again, we know that this was a shift in tone, so it's supposed to contrast with the claim before it, and that's what it did. All right. So make sure that you drill those exercises on the different types of passages, the different approaches, beginning to build your repertoire and your lexicon of phrases that are important to highlight. Again, correlative phrases, shifts in tones, setups for shifts in tones, claims, emotional emphasis words, again, shifts in tones, emphasis words, conclusion words, setups for shifts in tones, and yeah. So when it comes down to it, look at these different types of problems. You have these 3 different categories here. Again, a couple more examples of each of those categories of problems, so it's pretty relevant to the WMC. And if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I'll see you in the next video.